April 28, 2012. United Center, Chicago. 1 minute and 22 seconds on the clock. Derrick Rose was running toward the basket with that athletic explosion that had conquered the heart of an entire city. The scoreboard showed Bulls 103, Philadelphia 76ers 91. Game 1 of the playoffs practically decided, dream season materializing, bright future unrolling like a golden carpet in front of him. To understand how two simple words from Steph Curry saved a career that seemed lost forever, we need to go back to the exact moment when everything crumbled, because sometimes you can realize that life's most devastating moments prepare the ground for the most extraordinary transformations. It was a magical spring night in Chicago, one of those that gets etched in a city's collective memory. The April air carried the characteristic smell of renewed hope, hot popcorn, cold beer, and that electric energy that only 22,000 people screaming in unison can create. Derrick Rose was at the absolute peak of his powers. Only 22 years old, the boy from Englewood, who had grown up in the hard streets of the South Side, was redefining what it meant to be a point guard in the NBA. In the regular season that had just ended, he had become the youngest MVP in league history, surpassing legends like Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan in that regard. Have you ever wondered what it must be like to carry the dreams of an entire city on your shoulders? Rose made it seem natural. Every movement on the court was pure athletic poetry. Those explosive first steps that left defenders behind, those impossible finishes in the air, that unique ability to make 22,000 people rise from their seats simultaneously. The United Center was a cauldron that night. The walls literally trembled with the sound of MVP, MVP, MVP chants echoing through the stands like a religious hymn. It was impossible not to feel the electricity in the air, that palpable sensation that something special was happening, that an entire generation of fans was witnessing the birth of a new golden era of Chicago basketball. On the Bulls bench, Coach Tom Thibodeau watched his young star with a father's pride. Rose had finished the game with nearly perfect numbers: 23 points, 9 assists, 9 rebounds, 2 digits away from a triple-double in a playoff game, demonstrating the versatility and maturity that had transformed him into the undisputed leader of that team. Carlos Boozer, the veteran power forward, wiped sweat from his forehead while watching Rose command the offense like a maestro conducting a symphony. "This kid is special, man," he had murmured to Joakim Noah during a timeout. "I've never seen anyone so young with so much responsibility on their back play with this tranquility." Joakim Noah, the French center who had become Rose's best friend on the team, smiled while running back to defense. To him, Derrick was more than a teammate. He was like a younger brother who needed to be protected, cared for, supported. In locker rooms, on flights, in hotels, Noah was always there, ensuring that the weight of being the face of a historic franchise didn't crush the still young shoulders of Rose. What no one knew that night was that in a matter of seconds, all these plans, all these dreams, all this careful construction of a dynasty would turn to dust. The scoreboard showed a comfortable Bulls lead. With 1 minute 22 seconds on the clock, the game was practically decided. Rose could have easily left the court, rested for the next matchup, preserved his legs for the long playoff journey that would extend over the next 2 months. But that was never Derrick Rose's nature. Since childhood on the courts of Simeon High School, he had learned that you play until the final whistle, that you respect the game and the opponent by always giving your maximum, that you honor the trust of fans who paid their tickets to see you play. So there he was, running down the court with that characteristic intensity, even with the game virtually decided. The ball bounced in perfect rhythm in his hands, movements fluid like water, leg muscles coiling like springs ready to explode toward the basket. Naturally, this leads us to the moment that would change not just a career, but the trajectory of an entire franchise, an entire city, an entire collective dream. Rose attacked the basket, a movement he had done thousands of times, literally thousands, since he began playing serious basketball. A simple jump pass, trying to find a teammate near the basket. Nothing extraordinary, nothing risky, just fundamental basketball executed by one of the best players on the planet. The sound. Or better, the complete absence of sound. 22,000 people who were screaming in ecstasy 1 second before fell into absolute silence the next moment. It was as if someone had pressed the mute button on the universe's remote control. Rose was on the floor. Not the type of dramatic fall you see in movies, with screams and theatrical gestures. It was worse. It was silent. It was the type of fall you instinctively recognize as being serious, definitive, irreversible. He was holding his left knee with both hands, his face contorted not so much by physical pain, that would come later, but by immediate, visceral understanding that something fundamental had ruptured. Carlos Boozer was the first to notice. He committed a foul immediately, stopping the game, pointing down court where his teammate lay fallen. "D. Rose is hurt," he yelled, but his voice was lost in the frightening vacuum that had taken over the United Center. Joakim Noah ran the entire length of the court, his long hair flying while he knelt beside his best friend. You could see there were tears forming in his eyes before even knowing the extent of the injury. It was the type of instinct every athlete develops. The ability to recognize when something is really wrong. How is it possible that a moment can contain so much deafening silence? How is it possible that 22,000 people hold their breath simultaneously, and the resulting sound is even louder than any scream? Rose tried to get up. For some agonizing seconds, he struggled to put weight on his left leg, to take a few steps, to show the worried crowd that everything was fine, that it was just a scare, that the show could continue. He couldn't. The Bulls trainers ran onto the court, their professional faces masking the panic they all felt deep in their chests. Fred Tedeschi, the team doctor, knelt beside Rose and performed the preliminary tests he already knew by heart. Knee flex, lateral pressure, patella movement. Each test confirmed what he already knew from the moment he saw the fall. Rose's walk off the court lasted maybe 30 seconds, but seemed like an eternity. Supported on the shoulders of two trainers, visibly limping, he discreetly waved to the crowd that had begun chanting, "MVP! MVP!" in a desperate attempt to transmit positive energy. But everyone there knew. Players knew. Coaches knew. Fans knew. Something deeply touching is how certain truths are universal and instantaneous. You don't need to be a doctor to recognize when a career may have just changed forever. In the Bulls' locker room, after a victory that should have been celebrated, the mood was funereal. Carlos Boozer, still sweating with his uniform stuck to his body, looked at the ceiling with eyes red from contained emotion. "It's one of the saddest victories of all time," he told the reporters crowding around him. His voice trembled slightly, loaded with the weight of someone who knew he had just witnessed the end of something special. Joakim Noah was visibly emotional. "He's more than a basketball player to me," he said, wiping his eyes with a towel. "I consider Derrick like a younger brother. Seeing him hurt. It's never good." Tom Thibodeau, always controlled, always professional, struggled to maintain composure before the cameras, but anyone who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes, the understanding that carefully constructed plans for the season, perhaps for years to come, had just evaporated at 1 minute 22 seconds on the clock. The next day, exams confirmed what everyone feared but no one wanted to admit: complete rupture of the anterior cruciate ligament in the left knee. Immediate surgery necessary. Estimated recovery time: 8 to 12 months. Guarantees of returning to previous level: none. For a player whose identity was completely based on athletic explosiveness, on the ability to change direction instantly, on the skill to elevate over defenders as if defying gravity, it was more than a physical injury. It was a death sentence for everything he knew about himself. The city of Chicago entered collective mourning. Newspapers stamped headlines like "Shattered Dreams" and "Rose's Nightmare." Sports radios talked about "curse" and "cosmic bad luck." Fans created impromptu memorials outside the United Center, leaving flowers, support letters, and autographed jerseys. How many times in life do we witness the exact moment when collective dreams transform into shared nightmares? Chicago had experienced this with Jordan retiring, but that was a choice. This was different. This was cruel, random, unfair in the way that only fate knows how to be. In the weeks that followed, while Rose underwent surgery and began the long rehabilitation process, something even more worrying began to emerge. It wasn't just the knee that was broken. It was something deeper, more fundamental. For months, Rose had carried not just his own expectations, but the expectations of an entire city, of a historic franchise, of millions of fans who saw in him the possibility of returning to the glorious days of Michael Jordan. And now, in 1 second, all of this had crumbled. "Some falls destroy us," Rose murmured to himself during a particularly difficult physical therapy session, 3 months after the injury. He didn't know yet, but these words would become a prophecy that he would carry for months to overcome. The 22-year-old boy who had conquered the world was about to discover that there are types of pain that go far beyond the physical. He was about to learn that rebuilding a knee is infinitely easier than rebuilding a shattered soul. But he was also about to discover that sometimes, in the darkest moments, light can come from the most unexpected places. From people you never imagined would care. From words you never imagined you needed to hear. Some falls destroy us, but others prepare us to fly again. The real pain was still to come. 6 months after that fateful April night, Derrick Rose was sitting on the living room couch of his house in Northbrook, Illinois, looking out the window at a world that continued spinning without him. It was October 2012, and the new NBA season was about to begin. On his coffee table was a pile of fan letters he could no longer read, sports magazines with his photo on the cover that he turned face down, and a TV remote that had remained untouched for days. The smell of autumn rain entered through the half-open window, mixed with the heavy silence that had become the constant soundtrack of his life. It was the type of silence that didn't exist before the injury. A deafening void that made every second feel like an eternity. You can realize that there are 2 types of recovery: the one doctors can measure with tests and machines, and the one that happens in a person's soul when everything they know about themselves is called into question. Rose was discovering the hard way that the second is infinitely more complicated than the first. The surgery had been a technical success. Dr. Brian Cole, one of the best orthopedic surgeons in the country, had reconstructed Rose's anterior cruciate ligament with the precision of a craftsman restoring a masterpiece. Follow-up exams showed the knee was recovering exactly as expected. Physical therapy sessions progressed within the established timeline. On paper, everything was going perfectly. But Rose knew, with that visceral certainty that comes from the depths of the soul, that there was something fundamentally broken inside him that couldn't be fixed with scalpels or rehabilitation exercises. It was very difficult. Very difficult, he had murmured to Brenda Rose, his mother, on a particularly heavy morning when she brought coffee and found her son still in pajamas at 2 in the afternoon. "I love this game so much, Mom, and now I don't know if I still know how to love anything." Brenda sat beside her son on the couch, the same couch where he used to watch Bulls games as a child, dreaming of one day playing on that same court. The weight on his shoulders was palpable, as if he carried not just his own pain, but the pain of everyone who had bet their dreams on him. Dr. Michael Casale, one of the most respected cognitive neuroscientists who works with professional basketball teams, had studied cases like Rose's for years. His analysis of the young player's psychological trauma would later be described as devastatingly accurate. His injury must have caused as much mental trauma as physical. The neuroscientific part of me starts thinking about how the brain rewired itself. It must be incredibly impactful to have that unique moment changing how you think about yourself and your environment. That was exactly what Rose was experiencing. Every morning when he woke up, there were those 3 or 4 seconds of grace before reality hit like a freight train. For a few precious moments, he was still the 22-year-old MVP with the whole world in the palm of his hands. Then memory returned, and with it, the crushing weight of uncertainty. How is it possible for a person to feel lost inside their own home? Rose walked through the familiar corridors of his residence like a ghost, recognizing objects but unable to connect emotionally with any of them. The trophies on the shelf, including the MVP that had filled him with so much pride just months before, now seemed to belong to someone else, to a version of himself that perhaps no longer existed. Tom Thibodeau called every day. Joachim Noah appeared twice a week, always with some excuse, bringing food, watching a movie, playing video games. Carlos Boozer sent text messages regularly. The entire Bulls organization had mobilized in a silent campaign to keep Rose connected, to remind him that he was still part of something bigger. But the more people tried to help, the more isolated Rose felt. It was impossible to explain to someone who had never been through it what it was like to wake up every day not being sure who you are. What it was like to look in the mirror and see a stranger. What it was like to feel afraid of something you had loved your whole life. It was challenging to be happy without doing something that makes you happy, Rose would say later, in one of the rare interviews he gave about this period. That was the moment when I watched the most basketball and was furthest from basketball. It was torturous. Naturally, this leads us to the point where you realize that sometimes the distance between who we are and who we think we are can be an insurmountable abyss. Rose was discovering that he had based his entire identity on something that now caused him more fear than joy. The nights were the worst time. During the day, Rose could distract himself with physical therapy sessions, medical appointments, family visits. But when the sun set and Chicago prepared to sleep, loneliness descended on him like a thick and suffocating fog. He spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind running in vicious circles. What if I never can play at the same level again? What if my body never responds the same way? What if I disappointed everyone who believed in me? What if I'm not who I thought I was anymore? Something deeply touching is how fear can transform even the most familiar places into foreign territories. The room where Rose had slept for years now seemed like a cell. The house where he had celebrated so many victories now echoed with the sound of his own dark thoughts. Brenda Rose, who knew her son better than anyone in the world, could feel his pain radiating through the walls of the house. She had raised 4 children, had gone through divorce, had faced financial difficulties when Rose was small. But she had never felt as powerless as in those months watching her youngest son lose himself inside himself. Meanwhile, Chicago held its breath collectively. The 2012-13 season had begun, and the Bulls were playing without their biggest star. Joakim Noah had assumed the leadership role, but everyone knew there was a void in the team's soul that no strategy or adjustment could fill. Sports radios speculated incessantly about Rose's return. Newspapers published weekly articles with close sources, offering vague updates about his recovery. Fans created websites dedicated to tracking every public appearance of his, every photo, every rumor about how he was feeling. But Rose barely left home. The few times he ventured in public, for medical appointments mainly, he wore sunglasses and caps, trying to become invisible. Not because he didn't want to see the fans, but because he no longer knew how to be the person they expected him to be. Have you ever wondered what it must be like to carry the hopes of millions of people when you can't even find hope for yourself? Rose was learning that there are weights that go far beyond the physical, emotional burdens that can be more debilitating than any injury. It was a particularly gray November afternoon when Rose reached what he would later describe as his lowest point. He had been sitting in the same position on the couch for hours, watching without seeing some TV program, when his phone rang. It was a call from an ESPN reporter wanting a statement about rumors that he was considering early retirement. Rose hung up the phone without answering, but the question echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. Retirement. At 24 years old. The word seemed absurd and terrifying at the same time. For the first time since the injury, Rose cried. Not the contained tears he had shed at the United Center that April night, but deep and desperate sobs that came from the darkest place in his soul. He cried for the loss of innocence, for the death of dreams, for the version of himself that might never exist again. Maybe this is it, he whispered to the empty room. Maybe I can't do it anymore. Maybe it's time to stop. It was at this moment, at the bottom of the emotional well, that Rose most needed something he didn't even know was missing. Someone who could look at him and see not the broken player, but the human being who deserved a second chance to find joy. The tension was affecting the entire Rose family. Brenda, who had always been the pillar of strength for all her children, found herself entering Derrick's room at dawn just to make sure he was breathing. Reggie Rose, the older brother who had been manager and protector of Derrick throughout his rise to stardom, no longer knew what to say to motivate his brother. It's like a part of him died on that court, Reggie told his mother in a conversation he thought Derrick couldn't hear. And I don't know how to bring back something that might be lost forever. Dwayne Rose, another brother, had started avoiding the family home because he couldn't bear to see Derrick in that state. Alan Rose, the youngest of the family, still a teenager, made jokes trying to lighten the mood. But everyone could see he was also scared by the transformation his most famous brother had undergone. The house that had once been a sanctuary of joy and celebration now carried the weight of mourning for someone who was still alive, but seemed to have lost the will to live. How many times in life do we discover that our greatest strength can become our greatest vulnerability? For Rose, basketball had been everything: identity, purpose, joy, connection to the world. Now that same passion had become a source of pain, fear, and isolation. He spent hours looking at his own hands, these same hands that had controlled basketballs with magical artistry, that had lifted trophies, that had shaken hands with presidents and movie stars. Now they trembled slightly whenever he thought about returning to the courts. "Some falls destroy us," Rose said to himself on a particularly difficult afternoon, looking out the window at children playing basketball in the street. It was a phrase that had become a dark mantra, a truth he carried like a stone in his chest. He didn't know yet that this phrase was about to gain new meaning, that sometimes the most devastating falls are just the preamble to the most extraordinary flights, and that the person who would help him discover this was about to appear at his door in the most unexpected way possible. Salvation was on its way. It would come in the form of a young player who was living the best moments of his own career, but who carried enough wisdom to recognize when another warrior needed help. No one could imagine that moment would be the turning point. It was a cold October afternoon, 3 weeks after that darkest moment when Derrick Rose had considered retirement for the first time. The house in Northbrook was wrapped in the same heavy silence that had become its signature in recent months when the doorbell rang. Brenda Rose was in the kitchen preparing a soup she knew her son would barely touch when she heard the unmistakable sound of someone at the front door. She wasn't expecting visitors. The bee. Few people who still came to see Derrick always called first, knowing how sensitive he had become to surprises. Drying her hands on her apron, she walked to the door and looked through the peephole. On the other side of the glass was a young man she recognized immediately, though she had never met him personally. Curly hair, gentle smile, the bearing of someone who carried natural confidence without arrogance. Steph Curry was standing on the Rose family porch. "Mrs. Rose," Steph said when she opened the door, his voice carrying that particular mixture of respect and determination that few 24-year-olds manage to balance. "My name is Steph Curry. I know this might seem strange, but I came to see how D. Rose is really doing." Brenda stood in silence for a few seconds, processing the surreal situation of having one of the NBA's most promising players standing on her porch, asking to see her son. You can realize that there are moments in life that carry special weight, even before we understand why, and that was definitely one of them. "He's not receiving visitors," she said softly, not out of rudeness, but from instinctive maternal protection. "It's been difficult for him." Steph nodded with genuine understanding. "I figured. That's why I came. Not as an NBA player wanting to talk to another NBA player. I came as someone who, well, who cares about people going through difficult times." There was something in his voice, a sincerity that cut through the defenses Brenda had built to protect her son. It was impossible not to feel that this young man had made a significant journey. Not just the 45 minutes drive from Oakland to Northbrook, but an emotional journey to be there at that moment. Derrick was in the same place as always, sunk into the living room couch, staring without seeing at a TV showing reruns of old games he could no longer watch. When he heard voices at the entrance, he didn't lift his eyes. In recent months, he had developed the ability to become almost invisible even while being present. "Derrick," Brenda said softly, entering the room followed by Steph. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you." Rose lifted his eyes and felt a shock of surprise that was the first genuine emotion he had experienced in weeks. Steph Curry, the young phenomenon of the Golden State Warriors who was transforming the game of basketball with his impossible three-point shots, was standing in his living room. "Hey, man," Steph said, And naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that some words carry more healing power than years of therapy. There was no pity in his voice. There wasn't that excessive caution Rose had begun to hate in people's voices around him. It was just normalcy. "Curry," Rose responded, his voice hoarse from lack of regular use. "What? What are you doing here?" Steph sat in the armchair facing the couch, not too close so as not to invade personal space, but close enough to establish connection. "I came to see how you are. Really. Not the version that comes out in newspapers or on social media. How you really are." For a few minutes, they looked at each other in silence. Rose studying Curry's face, looking for signs of the condescending pity he had learned to detect in the eyes of almost everyone who visited him. Steph just waiting, with the natural patience of someone who understands that some conversations can't be rushed. "I didn't come here as a competitor," Steph finally said. "I didn't come as someone who wants to analyze you or evaluate when you're coming back. I came as a brother, as someone who plays the same sport as you and knows that, before we're players, we're people." Something deeply touching is how certain words can pierce defenses we spend months building. Rose felt something move inside his chest. Not hope yet, that would be too early, but perhaps the possibility that there were still people in the world who could look at him and see a complete human being. "Everyone wants to know when I'm coming back," Rose said, his words coming out like a confession. "Everyone has an opinion about what I should do, how I should feel, when I should be ready. But no one asks how I am, how I really am." Steph leaned slightly forward. "So I'm asking, how are you, Derrick?" And for the first time in months, Rose told the complete truth to another person. "I'm scared," Rose said, the words coming out as if they were physically and emotionally painful to pronounce. "I'm scared that I'll never be who I was again. I'm scared of disappointing everyone who believed in me. I'm scared that maybe I was never as good as people thought, and now that's going to be proven." Steph listened without interrupting, without trying to minimize or correct, just absorbing the words with the respect they deserved. "And the worst part," Rose continued, his voice breaking slightly, "is that I don't know who I am anymore if I'm not the guy who plays basketball. It's like my whole identity collapsed along with my knee. How is it possible for someone to carry so much emotional weight and still manage to breathe?" Steph was seeing up close what happens when an elite athlete has their identity completely destroyed, and the raw humanity of that moment affected him deeply. "I know everyone says they know how you feel," Steph said softly, "but I don't know. Only you know. And it's okay not to know if you'll be able to come back. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to question everything. I want to tell you something you might not know about me," Steph said, his voice gaining a more intimate, more vulnerable quality. "When I was younger, I had serious problems with my ankles, injury after injury. There came a point when doctors told me my career might be very short." Rose looked at him with renewed attention. In the media, Steph Curry always seemed invincible, the golden boy who turned everything he touched into gold. "I spent nights awake with pain, not just physical, but mental too, questioning if it was worth continuing to fight for something that might be destined to hurt me repeatedly." Steph paused, choosing his words carefully. "The difference is that everyone sees your injuries. My struggles, only I knew." It was the first time in months that Rose felt truly understood. Not judged, not analyzed, but simply understood by someone who had walked similar territory. "Pain is pain, man," Steph continued. It Doesn't matter if it's knee, ankle, or sole. It doesn't matter if everyone can see it, or only you know. What matters is how you choose to deal with it. Steph got up from the armchair and walked to the window, looking outside for a few seconds before turning back to Rose. There was something different in his posture now, as if he were preparing to say the words he had come specifically to pronounce. "D. Rose," he said, his voice carrying a gentle authority that made Rose pay complete attention. For the first time in months, you are not defined by what you can no longer do. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silence that had dominated the Rose house in recent months. It was expectant, loaded with possibility. You are defined by how you choose to rise up. Rose felt something move inside him, a sensation he had forgotten existed. It wasn't hope yet. It was more primal than that. It was the first glimpse of the possibility that there could still exist a version of the future worth living. Steph returned to the armchair, but now leaned forward, establishing direct and intense eye contact with Rose. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice gaining an intensity that filled the entire room. "Rise up." The two words hung in the air like a blessing, a prayer, a gentle command from the universe. Not because you have to prove something to anyone. Not because Chicago is waiting. Not because you owe something to the fans or to the league. Steph paused, letting each word settle in Rose's soul. Rise up because you deserve a second chance to be happy. Derrick Rose began to cry. Not the bitter tears of despair he had shed alone during so many dark nights, but tears of relief. The kind of crying that happens when a soul finally finds permission to begin healing. "Man," Rose said through the tears, his voice broken but loaded with something that had been absent for so long he almost didn't recognize it. Gratitude. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not as an injured player. Steph felt his own eyes fill with tears. There was something deeply sacred in that moment. Two young athletes, separated by rivalries and different teams, connected by shared humanity, and the understanding that some battles are too important to be fought alone. "Maybe I don't need to go back to being who I was," Rose said, the words coming out like revelation. "Maybe I can become who I'm supposed to be." Naturally, this leads us to the moment of clarity when you realize that sometimes we need to completely fall apart to discover who we really are underneath all external expectations and pressures. Steph stayed for another hour, not talking about basketball, not offering technical advice or recovery timelines. They talked about life, about family, about what it means to find purpose beyond the sport they practiced. When it came time to leave, Steph stood up and extended his hand to Rose, who shook it firmly. The first genuine, human touch he had experienced in months. "It doesn't matter if you come back to play or not," Steph said at the door, with Brenda Rose watching with tears in her eyes. "What matters is that you come back to living." He paused on the porch, turning one last time. "And when you're ready, the entire league will be rooting for you." As Steph walked toward his car, Rose stood at the door watching until he disappeared around the curve. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. For the first time since the injury, he could imagine a future that wasn't defined by what he had lost, but by what he could still build. "Rise up," he murmured to himself, and the words sounded different in his own voice. They sounded like possibility. Some falls destroy us. Others teach us that we were capable of flying from the beginning. We just needed someone to remind us to open our wings. And that's when the truth finally came to light. The morning after Steph Curry's visit, something fundamental had changed in the Rose family house. Brenda woke up at 7 in the morning and heard a sound she hadn't heard in over 6 months. Her son moving voluntarily around the house before noon. When she went down to the kitchen, she found Derrick sitting at the table, still in pajamas, but with a different posture. No longer hunched over himself as if carrying the weight of the entire world, but upright, looking out the kitchen window, where golden sun rays cut through curtains he had opened himself. "Good morning, Mom," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard since before the injury. It wasn't happiness yet. That would be asking too much so soon. But it was presence. It was the sound of someone who had decided to be present in their own life again. You can realize that sometimes healing doesn't come as an explosion of light, but like dawn, gradual, gentle, but irreversible once it has begun. "I want to call Fred," Derrick said, referring to Fred Tedeschi, the team doctor for the Bulls. "Not to talk about coming back. Just to know where I really am in recovery." Brenda almost dropped the coffee cup she was holding. For months, any mention of contact with the Bulls organization made Derrick recoil as if he had been touched by hot iron. It was the first time since the injury that he voluntarily mentioned any aspect related to basketball. "Are you sure, baby?" she asked softly, using the nickname she only used in the most delicate moments. "I don't know if I'm going back to play," Derrick said, the words coming out with raw honesty, but without the despair that had accompanied them before. "But I need to stop being afraid of finding out where I am. Steph said something yesterday that I can't get out of my head." He paused, as if savoring the words before pronouncing them. "Rise up. Not because I owe something to someone, but because I deserve a chance to be happy." The conversation with Fred Tedeschi lasted 45 minutes. For someone who had avoided any medical discussion for months, Derrick asked detailed questions about every aspect of his physical recovery. Not with the desperate urgency of someone wanting to return immediately, but with the cautious curiosity of someone trying to understand their own body again. "The knee is healing exactly as expected," Fred said, his voice loaded with relief and surprise at finally having this conversation. "Physically, you could start low-impact activities already. The question has always been, well, when you would feel mentally ready." "I still don't know if I feel ready for that," Derrick responded with honesty. "But I think I'm ready to try to find out." Naturally, this leads us to the moment when you realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to take the next step, even when fear is still present. 2 weeks later, Derrick stepped into the Bulls training gym for the first time in 7 months. The familiar smell of leather and sweat, which before represented home, now seemed foreign, as if he were a visitor in his own world. Joachim Noah was there, as if he instinctively knew this would be the day. He didn't make a big deal, didn't try to force emotions. He just nodded, that silent nod between brothers that means, "I knew you'd come back when you were ready." "I'm not here to train," Derrick said to the assistant coach, who approached excitedly. "I just want to feel a ball in my hands again. See if I still remember what it's like." What happened next was something witnesses later described as both magical and painful at the same time. Derrick picked up a basketball, held it for long seconds, feeling the familiar weight in his palms. Then, very slowly, he began to dribble. Bounce, pause, bounce, pause. How is it possible that something as simple as dribbling a ball could carry so much emotional meaning? Each contact of the ball with the floor was an act of faith, a small declaration that, maybe, just maybe, he could still have a future in that place. The months that followed weren't about going back to being the MVP. They were about Derrick Rose discovering who he was beyond statistics, beyond expectations, beyond the pressure of being the savior of a franchise. He began working with a sports therapist, not just for the knee, but for the mind. For the first time in his adult life, he began talking openly about pressure, about identity, about the fear of failing that had become so paralyzing. "I built my entire identity around being good at basketball," he said during a particularly revealing session. "When that was taken from me, nothing was left. I had to learn that Derrick Rose, the person, is worth more than Derrick Rose, the player." It was a lesson that Steph Curry had planted that transformative afternoon, but that Rose had to cultivate alone, day after day, through inner work that was much harder than any physical training. Steph's words became more than inspiration. They became a practical mantra that Rose used every day. When he woke up with knee pain, rise up. When he read negative comments about his prolonged absence, rise up. When he felt tempted to isolate himself again, rise up. But the interpretation of the words had evolved. It was no longer about rising up to prove something to the outside world. It was about rising up to honor his own humanity, to give himself permission to exist beyond others' expectations. Something deeply touching is how two simple words can become the foundation of a new life philosophy, transforming not just how someone plays basketball, but how someone chooses to live. Brenda Rose noticed the changes first. Her son was laughing again, not the forced laughs he had tried to produce to reassure the family, but genuine laughs that came from the depths of his soul. He began leaving the house without being pressured, visiting friends, becoming interested in things beyond his own pain. When Derrick Rose finally returned to the courts in the 2013-14 season, he was no longer the same player. He was something different, something that might have been even more valuable. He was a complete human being who also played basketball, not a basketball player trying to be human. His first official game was against the New York Knicks, and when he stepped onto the United Center court, the same place where he had shattered 18 months before, the crowd's ovation lasted 4 full minutes. It wasn't just celebration of an athletic return. It was recognition of an extraordinary human journey. Rose played only 21 minutes that night, scored 13 points, and distributed 5 assists. By any external standard, they were modest numbers compared to the MVP he had been before. But for those who knew the inner journey he had traveled, each point was a monumental victory. "It doesn't matter if I never make another All-Star game," he said after the game, his voice loaded with a peace that didn't exist before. "What matters is that I rediscovered why I love this game. Not for expectations, not for pressure, but for the pure joy of playing." Rose's transformation resonated far beyond basketball. His openness about mental health, about pressure, about the importance of seeing oneself as a complete person beyond the athlete, inspired a generation of athletes to talk about their own inner struggles. Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, Simone Biles all cited directly or indirectly Rose's journey as inspiration for their own revelations about mental health. He had become, without intending to, a symbol that true strength sometimes means admitting vulnerability. Steph Curry watched everything from afar, with the silent pride of someone who plants seeds without expecting recognition for the harvest. They met occasionally during Warriors versus Bulls games and always exchanged that special look between people who share a sacred secret. "You did it, man," Steph said, during an All-Star game years later, referring not to numbers or achievements, but to the journey of self-discovery Rose had undertaken. "We did it," Rose responded, because he had learned that the greatest victories are rarely solitary conquests. Have you ever wondered how a story can have a happy ending even when it doesn't end with the protagonist recovering everything they lost? Derrick Rose's story is exactly that, proof that sometimes winning means redefining what victory means. Trotits never returned to being the explosive MVP of 2012. His knee never recovered 100% of its previous agility. He never won the NBA championship that Chicago dreamed of, but he conquered something infinitely more valuable: inner peace, identity beyond sport, and the wisdom that his life had value independent of any athletic achievement. Years later, when young athletes went through similar crises, it was Derrick Rose's name that appeared as an example of how to navigate the storm. It was his story that sports psychologists told to illustrate that true strength sometimes means starting over, and always, always, the two words Steph Curry had pronounced that transformative afternoon echoed like a mantra of hope. Rise up. In 2019, 7 years after the injury that almost ended his career, Derrick Rose had a night that redefined what personal victory means. Playing for the Minnesota Timberwolves against the Utah Jazz, he scored 50 points, his highest scoring since his MVP days. But it wasn't the numbers that made that night special. It was what happened after the game. Rose sat on the bench, covered his face with a towel, and cried. Not tears of pain like that devastating April day in 2012, but tears of gratitude. For the journey, for the people who supported him, for the second chance to find joy in what he loved most. Some falls destroy us, he told the cameras that night, echoing the words he had carried for so long as a wound. Others teach us to fly again. The phrase that once represented despair now carried hope, transformation, and the wisdom that only comes from those who descended to the deepest valley and chose to climb back to the light. Today, when young athletes face devastating injuries, when pressure seems unbearable, when identity seems shattered along with the body, there is a story that therapists, coaches, and mentors tell. It's the story of how Steph Curry appeared at Derrick Rose's door with two simple words that saved not just a career, but a soul. It's the story of how rise up became more than a command. It became a life philosophy that teaches that our value as human beings never depends on our ability to perform. And when children in Chicago play basketball on the courts where Rose once dreamed, they don't just shout MVP, they shout rise up, instinctively understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is simply the courage to try again. Some falls destroy us. Others teach us that we were capable of flying from the beginning. We just needed someone to remind us to open our wings. The story of Derrick Rose and Steph Curry isn't about basketball. It's about humanity, about connection, about the transformative power of two simple words pronounced at the right moment by someone who cared enough to show up. Rise up. Always rise up. Because we all deserve a second chance to be happy.